The afternoon sun over Los Angeles in August of 1958 had that specific quality of light that makes everything look both more vivid and somehow unreal at the same time. And Frank Sinatra was standing in the parking lot of Capitol Records on Vine Street, watching a young session musician named David Coleman pack a trumpet case into the trunk of a car that looked like it had maybe 3 more months of reliable operation left in it. And Frank had not planned to be in this parking lot at this particular moment. He had finished his own recording session 2 hours earlier and should have been halfway to Palm Springs by now. But something had kept him in the building, some instinct he couldn't quite name. And now he understood what that instinct had been trying to tell him, because he had just witnessed something in Studio A that most people in the music industry would have simply accepted as the normal cost of doing business, but that Frank found himself unable to accept, which was why he was now standing next to a 1951 Plymouth in August heat talking to a musician he had never formally met. What had happened in Studio A was this. David Coleman, who was 28 years old and had been playing trumpet since he was 9, and who possessed the kind of technical precision combined with emotional intuition that made producers want to book him for sessions even though booking him came with complications that other musicians did not present, had been hired for an afternoon recording date backing a pop singer whose name was momentarily successful but would be forgotten within 18 months. And David had arrived on time, had set up his instrument, had played the arrangements exactly as written for the first 3 takes, and then during the 4th take something had happened. David had found a phrase in the second verse, just 4 notes, nothing revolutionary, nothing that deviated from the score in any technical sense. But those 4 notes had transformed the entire feeling of the passage, had given it a warmth and sophistication that the arrangement had been trying to reach, but hadn't quite achieved. And everyone in the booth had felt it. You could see it in the way the engineer had leaned forward slightly, and the way the arranger had closed his eyes and nodded. And after the take ended there had been that particular quality of silence that happens when everyone in a room knows they've just heard something special. The producer, whose name was Mitchell Hands, and who had been producing records for 6 years and believed he understood how the industry worked, had spoken into the talkback microphone and said, "Great take, that's the one, we're moving on." And then he had paused and added, almost as an afterthought, "Coleman, about that variation you did in the second verse. That was nice, but we're going to need you to play it straight on the final master. The artist wants it exactly as written." And David had looked up at the booth and said, very quietly, "That was exactly as written. I didn't change anything. I just phrased it the way it felt right." And Mitchell had said, "Well, it felt different, and different isn't what we contracted for. So on the master, we need you to pull back and play it plain." And there had been a moment where everyone in the studio understood that what was really being said had nothing to do with the music, and everything to do with the fact that David Coleman was a black musician in a predominantly white session, and that Mitchell Hands was operating under the assumption, never stated explicitly but woven into every institutional practice of the recording industry, that session musicians of color were hired to execute the charts with mechanical precision, but were not invited to bring interpretation or artistry or anything that might be perceived as creative authority. And David had sat there with his trumpet across his lap, and he had not argued or objected or done anything except say, "Understood," in a tone that was professional and neutral and completely empty of the anger that everyone knew he had every right to feel. And they had moved on to the next song. Frank Sinatra had been in the building reviewing some of his own masters with his engineer when he heard the playback of that 4th take coming through the hallway, and something about those 4 notes had made him stop and walk to the control room of Studio A and ask whose trumpet that was. And when the engineer told him it was David Coleman, Frank had stood there and listened to the rest of the session through the control room glass. And he had watched Mitchell Hands systematically diminish every moment where David's playing threatened to become something more than competent execution. And Frank had watched David Coleman accept each diminishment with the practiced grace of someone who had learned long ago that survival in this industry required swallowing things that should not have to be swallowed. After the session ended, Frank had intended to go directly to his car, but instead found himself waiting in the parking lot. And when David came out carrying his trumpet case, Frank had called his name. And David had turned with the slightly wary expression of someone who has learned to be cautious about unexpected attention from famous white men. And Frank had said, I heard you're playing in there. The second verse phrase that was exceptional, and David had said, "Thank you, Mr. Sinatra," in the careful tone of someone who is not sure where a conversation is going and does not want to presume. And Frank had said, "Mitchell Hands is an idiot. You understand that, right?" And David had smiled slightly, more reflex than genuine amusement, and said, "He's entitled to his preferences." And Frank had said, "It's not about preferences. It's about the fact that you made that entire song work, and he was too deaf or too committed to his own mediocrity to hear it. And I wanted you to know that someone noticed." And David had looked at Frank for a long moment, and something in his expression had shifted from wariness to something more complex. Not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of belief that this conversation was happening in good faith. And he had said, "I appreciate that, but it's not really about whether anyone noticed. It's about whether anyone does anything with what they noticed. And in my experience, most people notice plenty and then go on with their lives." And Frank had felt something in his chest that was part recognition and part fury, because David was right. Noticing was easy, noticing cost nothing. And the city was full of people who noticed injustice and then had another drink and forgot about it. And Frank had said, "Are you working tomorrow?" And David had said, "No, why?" And Frank had said, "Because I'm starting sessions for a new album next week and I need a trumpet player who can do more than read charts." And David had said carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I don't do charity bookings if you're offering me work because you feel bad about what happened in there. I'd rather you didn't." And Frank had respected that, had respected the refusal to accept pity disguised as opportunity. And he had said, "This isn't charity I heard you play. I need what you can do. And if you're not interested, that's fine, but it's a legitimate offer for legitimate work at union scale plus 20%, because I don't have time to audition anyone else and I trust my instincts." And David had studied him for another moment and then said, "What kind of album?" And Frank had said, "Standards, full orchestra, Nelson Riddle arranging. We're recording at Capitol starting Tuesday." And something had flickered in David's expression, because a Nelson Riddle session meant working with one of the greatest arrangers in popular music, meant being part of a production that would be heard by millions of people, meant something significantly different from backing a pop singer whose career would be over by Christmas. And David had said, "Tuesday I'm available." And Frank had said, "Good, be here at 2." And then he had done something that he later would not be able to fully explain even to himself. He had said, "And when Nelson sends you the arrangements, if you find a place where you think something could be better, you write it in. You don't ask permission. You don't apologize for it. You just do what the music needs." And David had looked at him with an expression that was part skepticism and part something like hope that was afraid to announce itself. And he had said, "Are you sure about that?" And Frank had said, "I'm never sure about anything, but I'm sure that whatever we capture in that studio needs to be the best version of itself. And the best version doesn't happen when everyone's playing it safe." And David had nodded once slowly and said, "Tuesday at 2. And Frank had watched him drive away in his dying Plymouth and had thought about all the David Colemans in the city, all the musicians who were extraordinary and who spent their careers being told to make themselves smaller so that other people could feel comfortable. And he had felt the specific kind of anger that doesn't burn hot but settles into something colder and more permanent. A determination that in whatever sphere he controlled, in whatever rooms he had authority, that particular form of diminishment would not be tolerated. The following Tuesday, David Coleman arrived at Capitol Records with his trumpet and his parts, and a small notebook where he had written 3 variations on 3 different arrangements, changes that were subtle but significant. And when the session began and Nelson Riddle counted off the first chart, David played it exactly as written on the first take. But on the second take, at the moment where his variation appeared in his notebook, he played it, and the string section behind him shifted to accommodate the new phrasing. And Nelson, who was conducting, paused after the take and looked at David and said, "Was that variation yours?" And David said, "Yes." And Nelson said, "Do it again, exactly like that." And they did. And when Frank listened to the playback, he heard not just the technical improvement but something larger. He heard what happened when a musician was given permission to bring their full self to the work, when the artificial ceiling was removed and excellence was allowed to find its natural level. And the album they recorded over the following 2 weeks became one of the definitive recordings of Frank Sinatra's career, an album that critics would later cite as a masterpiece of orchestral pop. And buried in those arrangements, woven through the horn sections and the brass flourishes, was David Coleman's trumpet, sometimes featured, sometimes supporting, always elevated beyond mere execution into something approaching art. What happened next happened quietly, without announcement or publicity, because that was how Frank preferred to operate when he was actually trying to change something rather than simply making a gesture. And what happened was that Frank began requesting David Coleman for his session. And when other arrangers and producers saw that Frank Sinatra was consistently hiring this particular trumpet player, they began hiring him too, not out of conviction, but out of the simple social mathematics that governs the entertainment industry. The calculation that if Frank Sinatra believes someone is valuable, then they probably are valuable. And within 18 months, David Coleman was no longer scrambling for session work. He was turning down sessions because he was booked solid. And within 3 years, he was leading his own combo in clubs on the Strip. And within 5 years, he had his own recording contract and was releasing albums under his own name. Albums that would later be recognized as important contributions to West Coast jazz. And through all of this, Frank and David maintained a relationship that was professional and cordial but never quite became a friendship in the conventional sense. Because they came from such different worlds and carried such different histories, that genuine friendship would have required a vulnerability that neither man was equipped to offer the other. But there was respect between them, and there was a recognition that something significant had happened in a parking lot in August. Something that had altered the trajectory of a life in ways that could not have been predicted, but could be clearly traced. Years later, in 1971, when David Coleman was teaching at a music conservatory in Oakland and occasionally playing sessions when the spirit moved him, he was interviewed for a jazz magazine, and the interviewer asked him about his early career in Los Angeles. And David told several stories about the session scene in the late 50s. And then, almost as an aside, he mentioned that Frank Sinatra had given him his first major break, and the interviewer, who was young and primarily interested in David's bebop innovations, asked a follow-up question about whether Sinatra had been easy to work with. And David had paused for a long moment, and then he had said something that the interviewer did not fully understand, but that David needed to say anyway. He said, "Frank did something for me that I didn't know could be done. He treated my playing like it mattered, and not in a patronizing way, not like he was doing me a favor, but like the music wouldn't be complete without what I brought to it. And that changes when someone with that much power decides that your contribution isn't a courtesy but a necessity." And the interviewer had written down the quote but had edited it out of the final article because it seemed tangential to the story he was trying to tell, which was a story about David Coleman's artistic evolution. And the interviewer did not understand that the quote was the story, that everything else David had accomplished had flowed from the moment in the parking lot when someone with power had chosen to use that power not to maintain the existing order, but to disrupt it, quietly and without seeking credit, simply because the alternative was unacceptable. Frank Sinatra died in 1998, and David Coleman died in 2004, and at David's memorial service in Oakland, which was attended by approximately 200 people including musicians, students, and family. Someone who had known David in the Capitol Records days told the parking lot story, and people in the audience who had never heard it nodded with the recognition that comes from understanding how small acts of integrity create ripples that extend far beyond their initial moment. And someone else mentioned that David had kept a photograph in his home studio, a black and white 8x10 from a 1958 recording session, showing the full orchestra with Nelson Riddle conducting and David visible in the trumpet section, second chair from the left, and on the back of the photograph, in Frank Sinatra's handwriting, were 4 words: "Play what needs playing," which was both instruction and permission and acknowledgement, and which David had framed and kept on his wall for 46 years. Long after the recording equipment changed, and the industry transformed, and most of the other musicians in that photograph had died or retired, because those 4 words represented something he had needed to hear at exactly the moment he had needed to hear it, which was that his artistry was not an inconvenience to be managed but a necessity to be honored, and that somewhere in the machinery of the entertainment industry, which so often operated on the principle of diminishment and control, there were people who believed that the machinery should serve excellence rather than containing it, and that this belief, when acted upon consistently and without performance, could change the shape of a life.